So just to do a brief welcome and introduction, welcome to Kazemi Con, guys. Thank you guys so much for contributing to this amazing new kind of event. Literally the first of its kind. And yeah, thank you so much for coming into everybody's spaces. So a little bit about me. My name is Kūnaʻe, or Cheyenne. Shy is fine. And my handle, Anthro-astrology, is derived from the fact that I am in school for anthropology, and I also study astrology. So I love both of them. It influences a lot of my studies. I've been studying various types of astrology for about 2 years now. And I wanted to do this panel be about conjunctions of the malefic because I am a Saturn-Mars conjunction native. So I thought it would be a really nice topic to touch on that I have personal experience in. And also, yeah, I think that the malefics get a bad rap sometimes, and I just want to reinforce some of the things that they can be associated with in a more positive light. Okay, so my intentions for this hour, I just want to talk about, like I said, some benefits that come from Mars and Saturn and how they are like presented and represented in different charts. Oh, requests. Okay, how they're represented in different charts. When I first saw my birth chart and I saw that like Saturn and Mars were conjunct in my chart, and everybody's like, oh, these are the bad planets, these are the malefics. I was like, what does that mean for me? That's scary. And even today I see a lot of hesitation and anxiety when it comes to Saturn-Mars transits, Saturn-Mars conjunctions, squares. We just had a Saturn-Mars conjunction in Aquarius earlier this year. And while everybody else in the world usually like gets a little anxious and a little nervous about what's going to happen during those hard aspects between Saturn and Mars, I find in my life that it is one of the most, I don't want to say peaceful, but it's one of the most in tune, or like I would say aligned parts of my year. It just feels like when those days come around, I feel like the world's energies and the energies that I live with are like pretty in sync, and it's not something that I experience a lot. All right, so getting into a little bit of the history of Mars and Saturn. So Mars and Saturn will meet up every other year-ish. The last time Mars and Saturn were together in Pisces, however, was March 1994. So if you know any March 94 babies, they have at least a Saturn-Mars co-presence, if not a Mars-Saturn conjunction. And talking about some benefits of Saturn, some benefits of Mars. Saturn is associated with taking things slow, maturity, being serious about stuff. But it can also be associated with durability, things that last. Time, so it's usually associated with older people or people who are just your senior in age and are just older than you. And also like structure and traditions. Mars can be associated, like some of the benefits of Mars is more associated with acute, quick actions. It can also be associated with activism, and instead of just being associated with aggression, it can be translating that so-called aggression to activism and standing up for yourself or for others. Both of these planets are very like transformational, but I would say Mars is transformational in the way of like combustion and like sudden transformations, and Saturn more works within the structure and transformation by maturity and learning, if that makes sense. Okay. And there are definitely some more negative, quote unquote, archetypes associated with these planets. So Mars is associated with war, it's associated with aggression, um, it's associated with violence, separation, you have strife, you have the hatred or just lots of negative feelings about people. And then it can also be associated with sharp things that you would use in the case of like battle or war, like knives, staffs, etc. Mars is associated with, like I said, traditions. It's associated with ruin, sorrow, isolation. Um, can also be associated with death, but in modern traditions, sometimes that is given to Pluto. I am not planning on going like super hard into like the significations of Mars and Saturn as individual planets because one of the other people speaking at KazemiCon, who is in here right now, Blaze, is doing he's going to be doing a panel on Saturn and Pisces. So if you want to know more about Saturn and Pisces specifically, I would check their panel out. But I also want to point out about Mars and Saturn that while it rules negative things like ruin, sorrow, isolation, death, or hatred, or violence, or war, it can also talk about the people who help to alleviate those things, who help to work against those things. So instead of representing death or isolation, it could be people who deal with death or isolation. So something like a coroner or somebody who helps counsel people after the death of a loved one. For Mars, it could be associated, like I said earlier, with activism. And then I just have a little chart here talking about like some comparative differences between Mars and Saturn. So I would like, if you associate Mars with sprinting, with very fast action, right? Aries, one of its signs, it's a cardinal fire. So it's like, I always like to envision it as the lit match. So it's a lot of energy put out at one time, like a sprint. And then if you compare that to something like running a marathon, it takes two very different types of people to run sprints and to run a marathon. And you usually don't find those two, like, you usually don't find one person that does those two things because they are so polar opposite. Like, imagine if you were sprinting in track and they're like, you should join the cross country team. Not sure that's the same. Not sure that's the same type of power. I mentioned earlier too that Saturn is being used, or Saturn is representative of older people or people who are just older than you. It's also associated with aging, right? So Saturn return is when Saturn returns to the place it was in your birth chart after like 27 to 29 years, and it's a signal of reaching a coming of age. Mars, on the other hand, is associated with youth. I've seen it associated with like babies' youth, but I've also seen it associated with just people who are adolescent and like pre-teenagers when they still have all that like childish energy and are just generally crazy. So yeah, speaking of like more generations, so Saturn is associated, it's a generational planet. It takes 27 years to come back to the same place in the zodiac sign, and it's the last visible planet and it's the slowest visible planet. So that's why it gets these significations of upholders of traditions. And Mars is along the same veins of it being associated with people who are younger than you. It can also be associated with the newest generation or the new generation upcoming after you. And when you have both of these energies together in one place, you can get a lot of this like push and pull, red light, green light, tug of war type of energy. So a good societal example of this is the rock and roll culture of the 1960s. So it was this revolutionary time for civil rights. It was a revolutionary time for women's rights. contraceptives, Woodstock, all these great grandiose things, all these big societal changes happening. And it faced a lot of pushback from the generation above them, saying that, oh, like, our kids are getting stolen by the devil. This is the devil's music. What's going to happen to them? And really, it was just this revolution of, like, coming up and challenging the traditions that are already set. So that's that Mars-Saturn interplay of the people coming up who are younger than the other generation, really testing and, like, poking the bear and seeing, like, okay, but do we actually need these things here? Like, what's the point? We can do it other ways. That energy can also be seen in the following Saturn cycle, when Saturn was in Pisces, in the alternative culture of the 90s. So the 90s comes around, we have another big wave of this, like, fighting traditions, going against the grain. Grunge music, alternative music comes out. Kurt Cobain is a really big example of this, because he was born during the 60s, during the first Saturn, Mars, and Pisces. And then he became big. He became a big name right after, or during his Saturn return, in the 90s, and became, like, kind of the iconic person to think of when you think of the origins of, like, grunge or alt music in the mid 90s. Like I said, they can signify, like, this red light, green light energy, the push and pull, because Saturn wants to do things one way. Saturn wants to take its time and be methodical and think things out and have a plan. And Mars is just ready to go. Mars is the friend who says you're taking too long to get ready, and they just want to go now. And people can really struggle with this power dynamic, whether it's in your chart or in a transit. You can feel a lot of this push and pull, like, I really want to do this one disciplined thing, but I just want to go out and have fun. And if you can balance that, they can really work well together, because it can give you this discipline, this really hard work ethic, and this drive to be serious, and patience to run the marathon. So I spoke earlier, Saturn is more so the planet associated with marathons, long distance running, because you need this long, disciplined, planned out way of how you're going to expend your energy. And then Mars is the planet of sprinting, and it releases all this energy. So if you can combine those two and figure out how to have that Martian energy for the length of time that it takes to run a marathon, that is a super athlete right there. And sorry, give me 1 second. I'm just looking at my notes here. Yeah, so I wanted to talk about some chart examples for this as well. I tried to pull some for most of the houses. I had trouble finding them for some of the houses. But I think that also speaks to how, like, having trouble finding them for certain houses, I think that also speaks to, like, how these people with Mars, Saturn co-presence or conjunctions, depending on, like, where this falls in their chart, they really tend to want to avoid the public eye, or maybe not avoid being famous. But a couple people in this list, they are famous, but they don't have a large, like, public presence. You don't see them out. It's not, like, a name that you talk about a lot. Okay, so I'm gonna pull up my first graphic here. Boop. Boop. Okay, so if you guys can see on the Jumbotron, there should be a chart from me. It says 11th house example. And this is the chart of Marie Curie. So if you don't know who Marie Curie is, she was a scientist, and one of her most famous one of her most famous discoveries was pioneering the research on, like, radioactive materials and radioactivity. And she was the first woman to win a Nobel Prize. And she faced a lot of pushback for this. And if you look at her chart, you see that Venus, the planet usually associated with women or people who identify as women, is what we call besieged or squished between those two malefics in her 11th house. So this really this really spoke to me about how like she did a lot of really hard work, and she had people in her corner, but she still faced a lot of pushback for just being a woman in science at the time that she was, and people who just like didn't believe the work that she was doing purely because she was a woman. I also mentioned in a bit of a literal example, Marie Curie died from radiation poisoning from her own research. So it's really interesting, right? So she's a Capricorn rising. Um, you know, the house and the planet that controls the body is Saturn in this case, which controls the bones, and it's co-present Mars, which is usually associated with blood, and the sun, which is associated with the heart. And she died from a specific type of anemia where the radiation had deteriorated her bone marrow so much that she couldn't produce new blood cells. So it's a really interesting play of like her own invention causing her demise in a way. But yeah, she did a lot of really amazing work, and even to this day, like she's accredited with how we understand radioactivity to this day. I don't have a chart graphic for this one, but I did have a 12th house example as well. So 12th house significations, like with the Mars Saturn conjunction, this can be like repressed emotions or repressed anger, and whether that's doing it like voluntarily, like you want to repress your emotions, or you are forced to repress your emotions either by your PR team or your family, or 12th house is literally the house of like foreign entities or hidden enemies. But reflecting back to what I said earlier, because the 12th house can also be representative of like taboos and people who don't fit within society. So this can also be seen as like fighting for those people, fighting for the people who are hidden from society, and working in fields for marginalized groups. Venus Williams has this placement. She has a 12th house Mars Saturn conjunction. And she has done a lot in like trying to fight for women's equality on the court, trying to fight for equal pay for women's tennis players as opposed to men's tennis players. And she's done a lot of philanthropy work with her sister as well. I don't know if I mentioned the significations I had for Mars Saturn in the 11th. I just kind of like breezed into Marie Curie's chart. But I have down that like 11th house Mars Saturn conjunctions can be associated with like really strong like support systems and really strong networks, but they might be specific, or they might be niche as to who is within those networks. But it's like a ride or die type of network, because how many years later since Marie Curie died? She died in 1934. How many years later, and she is still like heavily respected in the scientific community. I do have a 10th house example before I pull it up. This placement, Mars Saturn in the 10th, is this juxtaposition of like following traditions in whatever career you aspire to, but also breaking the traditions. So it's almost like bending the rules to see how far you can bend them without breaking them, and then like breaking them and just being like, oops, oh well, like I'm gonna break them anyway. Oh wait, did I not save this chart? I thought I did. Oh, pause, my bad. I thought I had an extra chart saved, but I don't. By the way, if anybody has any questions, feel free to request a mic, or you can type out your question in the little comment box down on the bottom right-hand corner. Hillary. I know I have her saved. Okay, well. Sorry, I thought I was all prepared. Okay. Yeah, so Hillary Clinton has this placement in her 10th house. And that definitely speaks to the fact that she was the first woman to run for president and the first woman to like get the Democratic nomination to run for president. Because, you know, she's still running for president, right? She's not trying to like create her own government outside of the U.S. government. So she's still working within these Saturnian frameworks. But with Mars there, and she also has Pluto there too, so that even like that adds even more emphasis to this like revolutionary new powers and revolutionary new traditions. But yeah, with Mars there, it's definitely breaking traditions, but also following them in your own way. For ninth house, I had a really interesting example, but it wasn't exactly Saturn Mars conjunction in the ninth. So for the ninth house is like higher education, travel, religion, spirituality, and like how you relate to faith. Hi. Hi, R. But yeah, so the ninth house is so higher education, travel, religion, spirituality, and how you relate to faith. And the example that I had was Martin Luther. So his was really interesting because he had Saturn, Mars, and Scorpio in the fourth house, but it was ruling his ninth house Aries moon. So definitely more of those like themes of tradition and breaking traditions, and he was like a religious defect, and he created his own religion, and that's very Mars Saturn, just like breaking traditions but then creating your own very strict traditions. I just This is why I love like Mars and Saturn, especially like the interplay between them, because when they come together, they can manifest as I would say like very big power moves, I guess is the way I would say it. Because so it's one person running for the first female president of the United States, is another person winning the first Nobel Prize as a woman. It's somebody else literally creating their own religion. Um, yeah. I really like my eighth house example. So the eighth house is other people's money, it's debt, it's taxes. Um, so it can be servicing others, or if you're a certified like personal accountant, literally doing other people's taxes. Um, I have it down as it could also be paparazzi, because in a way, like they are the only job that they have is like through the person that they're taking photos with, and their job purely depends on like the photos and the stories that they get about these people. And one really interesting example I had about this is Jerry Springer, which he doesn't technically fall into the category of paparazzi, but yeah, he definitely has the same benefiting off of other people. He would have all these problems, all other people's conflicts on his show, and that's how he would make money, from like antagonizing other people's conflicts and kind of like throwing fuel on the fire of other people's situations. Man, now I wonder what he's doing nowadays. Sometimes I like doing that. I just like looking for other people, like I just like looking for celebrities who were like falling off and haven't done anything in a couple years. So the seventh house, I have seventh house associated with partners, marriage, other people, but not just like romantic partnerships. It can also be family relationships. It can be business peers, just people that you are in some way involved with. And when you have Mars and Saturn in these placements, it can be having conflict with others, but really like not wanting to address it or trying to avoid addressing the conflicts with other people. Situationships, I feel like, is a really seventh house type of placement. It's like, oh, I kind of want this commitment, but I kind of don't, but I have fun with you, but I don't want it long term. I don't really know. We'll see where it goes. And I also put down ghosting and multiple relationships. So multiple relationships can be like, what's the word? Consecutive, so like one after the other, multiple relationships, or ghosting, which is more of like that Saturnian decision with a Mars split decision of like, yeah, no, I'm just not talking to this person anymore, and I'm not gonna let them know. The seventh house example I have for Mars Saturn is Zack Snyder, and I do have his chart. I do know I have Zack Snyder's chart, and I was prepared. Okay, so we have Zack Snyder, and let me pull it up on my laptop so I can see a big version and I'm not hunching over my phone the whole time. Okay, so speaking of this, Saturn-Mars conjunction is going to be happening in Pisces in 2024, and speaking of Saturn-Mars conjunction in Pisces, Zack Snyder was born during the Saturn-Mars co-presence in 1966. His conjunction is a little loose, but his Saturn is at 18 degrees, Mars is at 24. But I had problems finding people with like tight conjunctions. So this works anyway because I used him as an example for the seventh house, because if you look at his chart, the ruler of his 10th house is in his 7th, and the ruler of his 7th is in his 10th. So there's this big play between other people and relationships and how it plays into his career. And he actually, I think they're divorced now, but his wife, he originally met her when he was working for her on some film. And then they finished the project together, whatever. And then they started dating, and then they got married. And then he had this marriage that was like intertwined with his work, because they met each other through work. So I think that's like a really obvious example of like the power dynamics of Mars and Saturn together in an angular house, especially like in the 7th house, or having reception to the 10th house. I don't know how many times he's been married. I don't want to misquote, but I feel like he's been married a couple times. I'm gonna look it up because I don't want to misquote. Oh, they're still married. Well, good for them. I'm glad they're still married. But yeah, so power dynamics, I feel like that's just a great word for like all of these situations. It's just working within power dynamics and how you address power dynamics. So Zack Snyder working with his wife, Jerry Springer, Martin Luther, all these people have really like harnessed these ideas of power dynamics and made it work for them in whichever way that expresses itself. Moving on to the 6th house, this is the one I have personal experience with. So 6th house is the house of like pets, physical routine, wellness, illness. So this house with Saturn, Mars there, it's marathon energy. It's that ability to have a really hard work ethic and know when you need to call it quits. So my mom is always worried for me. She's like, you're going to burn yourself out. You can't keep burning the candle at both ends. It's really dangerous. Like, I don't want you to get injured. I was like, Mom, I have a really good grasp of how far I can push myself before I just need to stop. And I will. Like, if I'm working really hard at a job and it's just not for me anymore, I'll just quit. Like, it won't even be like, oh, I need a day off. I'll just have reached my threshold and I'm like, yeah, no, I can't do this anymore. I also see like sixth house Mars placements because Mars joys in the sixth house. I see sixth house Mars placements with Saturn as people who like the gym or people who work at a gym. Um, athletes usually have like prominent Mars placements, so Mars joining in its house, that's a nice placement. And yeah, so like I said, from a personal perspective, the Mars Saturn for me has largely been about this, like working within power dynamics in work, but also realizing that if the power dynamic is not suitable for me, I will just leave. Like some other people might stick around and try to work it out. But when I reached my breaking point, I was like, yeah, this isn't worth my health anymore. I'm leaving. I have better things to worry about. Fifth house example. So these people, Mars, Saturn in the fifth house is really funny because Venus is the planet that joys in the fifth house. It's about like creativity, children, dating, self-expression, self-confidence. So to have like the Malefics in the fifth house kind of adds like a lot of juxtaposition. So it's people who are either really serious about art or they're too serious for art. People who would be like, these are people that were like, oh no, like I'm not a creative person, I'm more of a numbers person. But I usually argue with them that math and numbers is art because it had to be invented at some point by a human mind. But that's I could go off on a whole tangent about how everything is art. I also mentioned, since it's a house of like creativity, children, dating, self-expression, and sex, I also said that like with this Saturn Mars conjunction, this can be people who are horny but could be picky about their partners, and so they don't actually date anybody. They just talk about how they want to date somebody, but they never go on a date. And I also put BDSM in this house because, yeah, I feel like more about those power dynamics. So it's like, who is taking the reins in this power dynamic? Who is relinquishing control in this power dynamic? And in the house of dating, self-expression, and creativity, I feel like those two planets, it's expressing power dynamics, fits very well here. I have two different examples for the fifth house. The first one I don't have a chart for, so I'll just mention her real quick. This is Priyanka Chopra, or Priyanka Jonas now, so she married one of the Jonas brothers. So she had two weddings. She had a traditional wedding, and then she had a non-traditional wedding. So speaking about dating and self-expression, she understood that she really wanted to represent her own culture, and she wanted to have a traditional wedding. But she also just wanted to do one that was fun, and she wanted to do what she wanted. So she struck this balance by deciding to do both. Instead of just having one wedding and having to compromise on things that she wanted for that day, she did both, and she got to do exactly what she wanted in each one. And then the second example I have for the fifth house is Mr. Walt Disney himself. And I feel like, right, so talking about people who are serious about their art, Walt Disney has literally turned creativity and like creative licensing into a business. It started out with like a cute little mouse on a steamboat cartoon, and here we are like 100 years later, and Disney is this huge corporation, this huge like global entity that has literally capitalized on creativity and capitalized on the magic of creativity and like all the things you can do out of art. Speaking back to the power dynamics, I don't know if anybody knows this, but if you work at Disney Studios as like an animator, anything you draw during your time working there is Disney property. So even down to the things that people are creating when they work for this company is part of Disney. And that's playing more into this power dynamic, this push and pull of like who has the power in this relationship and who's going to exert it. But that's also coming to change too, because a bit of a tangent here. Mickey Mouse is entering public domain soon. So when that happens, anybody will be able to use Mickey Mouse without fear of legal repercussions from Disney. That's an oversimplification. I am not a copyright or public domain lawyer, but yeah. Especially too, because like his Mars is exalted because it's in Capricorn, and then Saturn is in domicile in Capricorn. And then if you look at the very end of his fifth house, he also has Venus there. So talking about Venus joining in the fifth house, he just has this really funny chart where like, yeah, he is a really creative person because he has Venus in the fifth house, but he's also a very serious business oriented person. Who has this really hard drive, and he's like, yeah, I'm gonna turn it into a business. This is gonna be a global entity. So fourth house, so the fourth house is associated with like your legacy or family roots, private life, and it was hard to find charts for this house specifically because this house is about like wanting to act and plan things in private. So it kind of makes sense that it's gonna be a hard time finding prominent people who have this placement, because I don't think these would really be the people to be drawn into the public eye in the first place. But if I remember correctly, I think Billy Crystal. Yeah, Billy Crystal has a fourth house Saturn Mars conjunction. And he's not largely seen that much anymore. 20 years ago, definitely. But all in all, he's always been a very, like, I would say understated celebrity. That could just be me because I'm a millennial and I don't have like prior reference from before I was alive, so I might be wrong, but yeah. So going to the third house example that I have for Saturn Mars conjunctions. So the third house is related to like daily commutes or travels, communications, the mind, siblings, daily rituals. So one kind of literal, I guess it's sort of literal, not really, but interpretation of this is, okay, you have the planet of older people and the planet of younger people in the same house, in the house of siblings. This could literally manifest as you having a lot of siblings who are both older and younger than you. But I also wrote down that it can represent old cars, vintage cars, perhaps. And my favorite just kind of like thrown in their signification, I said old curmudgeon-y neighbors. So like old neighbors who are just always complaining about something. I'm thinking like Oscar the Grouch. Like he just complains. He lives in a trash can. He's just always eavesdropping, and he always has something to complain about. So to the second house. Second house is about material possessions, finances, things that you have physically. And for the Mars Saturn conjunction, I said it was this desire to work hard, this aspiration to achieve in the workplace. But can it also be like, it can also relate to being anxious about money. So anxious about the things that you have aren't going to last. And usually if it's just Mars in the second house, I would see that as, wow, this person probably spends a lot of money and it's probably burning a hole in their pocket. But with Saturn there, it's navigating those energies. It's like negotiating with that type of energy. So I would say there's a little bit more self-control so you don't burn a hole in your pocket, or it could be that you have enough money coming in that the amount that you're spending is not over the amount that you're making, so it's not putting you into debt or anything. This one I also had issues finding examples for. The closest example I found was Zoe Saldana, who she is an actor. The interesting thing about Zoe Saldana is, like, she has been in, like, I forget the number of it. She's been in, I think, like 3 of the top 5 grossing movies of the last 20 years. And those numbers might have changed by now because, you know, new movies come out all the time. New movies top the charts all the time. But, yeah, I do know for a while there, she was, like, in 3 of the 5 top grossing movies to ever be produced. And if you don't know what she was in Avatar, the first one. She's also going to be in the second one. And then she was also in Guardians of the Galaxy. And then since she was in Guardians of the Galaxy, she was also in the Avengers. Which one was it? Oh, Infinity Wars and Endgame. I've watched all the movies, but they just blend together to me at this point. Another sort of example that I had, but this one was kind of different, was I found somebody with a mutual reception. So Queen Elizabeth actually has a mutual reception of these 2 planets between the 2nd house and the 11th house. So she has Mars in Aquarius in the 2nd house, and then she has Saturn in Scorpio in the 11th house. I mean, I feel like I don't have to say that much about Queen Elizabeth because it's Queen Elizabeth, but she, you know, had access to all this material wealth because she's literally a queen, and she was assisted and supported by this large, what's the word for it? Organization, I guess, like the tradition, the family, the entity that is like the royal crown, the entity that is like the royal family, and how they move throughout the world. So her material possessions are directly a result and supported by this large organization, this large tradition that upholds her. I guess upheld her. And finally, we are at the 1st house. I chose to move backwards like this. I didn't even say this in the beginning either because I was a little nervous in the beginning. Not gonna lie, don't know if anybody could clock that, but I'm like settling in now. But I forgot to mention this when I started going through the examples, but the reason I wanted to work backwards from the 12th house to the 1st house is I found a lot more examples. I found better examples of these power dynamics in the later houses. And then it was when I started to get to the more personal houses, like the 4th house and then the 2nd house relating to your material possessions, that I had issues finding people who had these placements that had public charts. And all of these charts all of their times are A or AA rated, so that was part of it too. I didn't want to use a chart that didn't have a good timing rating, because especially if we're talking about houses, like, we need to know the times. Okay, so finally on the 1st house. On the 1st house, the 1st house is related to self-image, the physical health, and just your physical corporeal form. Mars and Saturn in the 1st house, it can be, I feel like this is one of the houses that can be like one of the most perceived because it is the 1st house and it is like the house of yourself and your physical body. But it can be things like bursts of energy to tiring quickly from really expressing yourself and being out there to completely falling off the map and not talking to anybody. And one of the good examples of that two examples of that are Al Gore and Danica Patrick. So Al Gore ran for president in 2000, lost to George Bush in a recount, but he was very outspoken about global warming. He was very outspoken about climate change, and for that span of time, he was very prominent in the media. And even outside of the fact that people usually take a pause of silence after they lose a presidential election, it's been quite a while now, and he still does work, but he has not aimed for the same level of publicity that he had during that time. And Danica Patrick as well. Danica Patrick was the first female NASCAR driver, and she was really active for, I think, about 6 or 8 years in the early 2010s. But she has stopped racing since 2017. She really stopped participating in more races, and then her final race before she stopped was in 2018. And again, like, she got a lot of publicity, if I can talk today, a lot of publicity for being the first female NASCAR driver just because of who she was as a person. And then after she decided to retire, she hasn't really strived to stay in the public light. She's just kind of gone about it by herself without really any publicity involved. But my favorite example that I have, and I might be a little bit biased for this example because this person is an anthropologist, but my first house example is Margaret Mead. So Margaret Mead was an anthropologist. Oh, what is happening? What does my computer do? Margaret Mead was an anthropologist who did a lot of work in the turn of the 20th century. Is that right? No. Okay, yeah. Early to mid 20th century. She was born at the turn of the 20th century. But she did a lot of work related to sexual liberation and sexual societies, and like how different societies perceive sex and address sex. So one of her most popular books was about sexuality and sexual practices in Samoa. And needless to say, when you make stuff like that and you publish it in like the 1950s, 1960s, people are going to have issues with it. And people thought that she was absolutely asinine. People thought that she was just like a crazy woman who was just trying to portray all of these, what they would see as like primal and like primalistic savage types of sexuality practices onto these people, because the other anthropologists that were working with her, that were men, that were white, they were like, no, sexual idealism is the same across the whole globe. What do you mean? Like, everybody believes that virginity is the same thing around the whole world. And that is not the case. That is not the case. So in Margaret's chart, she has Mars, Saturn in the first house in Capricorn. Again, wide orb, but Mars is exalted in Capricorn, Saturn in domicile in Capricorn, and then it's also conjunct Jupiter, and she has her Venus in there as well. So she really challenged a lot of these power dynamics, not just within like the field of anthropology, which was really going through a revolution in like the 50s and 60s. It wasn't just like the sexual revolution that happened with like rock and roll music. It was a lot of like sociology and social studies revolutions as well, getting away from a lot of like the colonialist, race-based, biased views that were still held like going into the 40s and post World War II in the 50s. But yes, like I said, she's most well known for the book that she did about Samoa and Samoan practices, and she's widely regarded in anthropology as one of the founders of anthropology. If you take an Anthro 101 class, you will learn about her. As well as one of her mentors, Franz Boas. But yeah, so post post-mortem for Margaret Mead, after her death, there was actually a researcher who came out, and he basically tried to negate everything that she said. He's like, this isn't true. This is just her own biased opinion. Like, you just misunderstood the culture when you went there. That's not what really happened. So this guy's just trying to mansplain, like, these personal observations that Margaret Mead was having. And so this is one of the wildest parts, is Margaret, she was very careful about shielding the identity of her, of the people she interviewed in Samoa. But somehow this guy actually tracked down one of her original participants and supposedly interviewed them. And he reported back saying that this person willfully misled Margaret, and that she only said that because that's what she wanted to say. And that she was just telling stories, and then, like, this isn't what they actually believed. So there was definitely like this attempt, even post-mortem, to like take her down from her well-deserved pedestal of an iconic anthropologist. But in her chart, so she has Mars exalted in Capricorn, she has Saturn in domicile in Capricorn, but by degree, both Benefics, Jupiter and Venus, are superior to them in progression, and Venus is the ruler of her MC. So even post-mortem, when these people were attacking her work and attacking her character, her work spoke for itself, and the organizations that supported her spoke for her. And they said that his work was just bad. It's not scientific. It's misleading. Like, you don't have any sources that these people said these things. So yeah, that's one of my favorite, like, Mars Saturn examples, because fighting more power dynamics and then coming out on top even after death. All right, I got about 10 minutes left here. If anybody has any questions or they want to like throw up any comments in the little comment section, go ahead. But I do want to talk about one more thing that's somewhat related to Mars Saturn. I mean, it is related to Mars Saturn, but a little bit of a different vein than what we have been talking about. Instead of like house examples, I want to talk about this eclipse that is happening when Mars is in Pisces with Saturn come 2024. So let me pull up the eclipse on my computer here. Okay. So this eclipse will have the Sun and Chiron and Moon conjunct to the minute in Aries. And when I saw this, I was like, wow, that's really, that's like a really big deal. Like, I wonder when the last time that happened was. And thanks to astroseek.com and their ephemeris search engine, I could figure that out. And this is actually the first time since 155 BCE that we've had a solar eclipse in Aries while the malefics are conjunct in Pisces, ruling the eclipse. I didn't even include Chiron in there. That's probably like the time it's been since Chiron has been smushed in the middle of that eclipse is probably like 2 or 3 times longer than that. But yeah, I thought this eclipse was really interesting to look at. The nodes are in new signs by this time, so we are in a totally different ecliptic system and ecliptic angle. And yeah, so with this eclipse, for the moment of the eclipse, it is a Taurus rising chart. So that means the eclipse is happening in the 12th house of like secrets, hidden enemies, foreign bodies, foreign travel, mental health, large animals. I like that one. That's like a very one-off signification for the 12th house that I've seen. Joe Exotic has prominent 12th house placements, and he's a tiger guy. But yeah, so this solar eclipse in the 12th house, with the ruler of Mars conjunct Saturn in the 11th house, it's giving themes of support systems and alliances like some coming to bat for you, but then others like not coming to bat for you. So then you see who they truly are, especially with Chiron like stuck, like literally wedged in the middle of the luminaries. Yeah, I was just in the middle of doing my Mars Saturn research. I was looking at these dates for 2024, and I was like, wait, the sun is close to the nodes. There is an eclipse happening soon. We should look at that. And then I realized that it was the first eclipse like this since 155 BC. So yeah, this is definitely more on the same themes of power dynamics. But yeah, I will definitely be looking into this eclipse more because I just kind of found this somewhat last minute. But my content is a lot of niche historical mundane astrology, of just looking up the last time events happened and then analyzing historical events that happened during that time. Obviously, I can't do that since this event hasn't happened in like almost no, more than 2,000 years. Yeah, in like over 2,000 years, almost 2,200 years. But yeah, I will definitely be looking at this chart in relationship to some nation charts. But yeah, thank you guys for coming in. Does anybody have any questions, concerns? I really like what Rose was saying in her space. She was saying questions, concerns, death threats. Yes, thank you guys for coming in. Thank you, everybody. And if you guys want to hear more from me, I am doing another talk tomorrow. It is about more historical mundane astrology, and it is titled "The Kazemi That Colonized the Pacific." So I'll be looking at the journeys of Captain Cook. He was a very avid astronomer and navigator, and he was very detailed in his journals of when things were happening. So I'm going to be looking at some historical transits while he was doing his voyages. And there's some very interesting things lining up with like some Venus Kazemi, some eclipses that were happening while he was, sailing across the world. And I'm really excited to talk about it. So with that being said, I will see you guys later, or I will see you guys tomorrow in my space. And thank you again, everybody, for coming out and for supporting KazemiCon, the first free online, open to the public astrology conference. And yeah, I hope everybody has